Hello, my name is Shaughnessy, and this is my podcast called Samples of Science Cuisine, and I would like to introduce today's guest.
So tell me a little bit about yourself, like what are your qualifications, what's your job here, position?
Okay, so I got a PhD in animal science from Virginia Tech.
Okay.
I did a postdoc at the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey. So I think it's called Rutgers in Newark. So
Yeah.
I was at the University Hospital in Newark doing immunology there before I started here in 2011. So
Okay.
started here then and have been promoted to full professor in the
Nice.
last 12 years.
So what is the courses that you teach here?
I teach kind of a introductory to animal science or principles of animal science. I teach parasitology, the laboratory portion, live animal evaluation, small ruminant production, and I do a graduate level immunology course.
My major is immunology and medical microbiology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting that you teach immunology in the agricultural sciences. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's because when they have you teach immunology over there, they get pieces of it in like 4 or 5 different classes.
Yeah.
You don't take a immunology class.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, we do immunology just like you do with mice or rats or
Mhm.
human or looking at those different models. We just look at it from the context of production livestock and how immune responses would vary, how we can select animals with better immune responses, and how that may influence disease issues in animals, reduce antibiotic usage, those type of things.
That's interesting. Does a lot of the immunology aspect come from, like, do you have anything to do with how vaccines were developed with animals?
So most of what we know about immunology starts in cattle.
Yeah.
So the word vaccination comes from the word vaca for cattle.
Mm-hmm.
We know B cells, and the B cells get their name from the bursa fabricius in chickens. So a lot of historical things with immunology all started with livestock,
Yeah.
and then it kind of migrated over to human health and looking at using different animal models. I don't do a lot of vaccine work per se, just because it requires different levels of it requires different levels of inspection. So
Yeah.
different animal care stuff turns you into a BSL-3 lab, depending on what pathogen you're working with, and it just becomes more complicated. What I try to do is get to the interface of of basic immunology and how we can apply that to producers so that they can improve health in their animals.
Okay, that makes sense. I just recently started a book about, like, the beginning of vaccine development, and it
Mhm.
talked about how I forget the guy's name, but how he used cowpox to create a vaccine for smallpox, and I thought
Mhm.
that was really interesting, and that's how the word vaccine, like you said, came from cows. I thought
That's
that
right.
was really interesting.
So before we had vaccination, we had variolation,
Yeah.
right? So that was when they're taking cowpox and doing that. So if you work with Dr. Dameron over at Health
I'm in
Sciences,
his lab.
okay, so he has one of his postdocs that are working with me, and they're trying to see if they can use the COVID platform on sheep cells.
Interesting.
So, and Dr. Dameron and I have worked together before, and we've had grants through the Vaccine Development Center
Hmm.
for some projects that we've done in the past.
That's really interesting. So what did you say your major was in your undergrad?
And my undergrad was at Chico State, Northern California. I was an agriculture science major.
So
I wanted to be a high school ag teacher.
So why did you decide to choose that major in college?
I grew up on a farm in Southern California, and I didn't know what I wanted to do really, and I had really good mentors when I was in junior college and then also at the university that helped direct me into an area they thought that I would do well with, and that was
Mhm.
teaching. To come to find out, I have 3 sisters. All 4 of us are teachers.
Yeah.
So we're all teachers. 3 out of the 4 of us have advanced degrees. So we're all really good at it's a genetic trait that
Yeah.
we're all very good at that. So I was working at Chico, or I was at Chico State up in California, and did my degree in agriculture science, and then was a high school ag teacher in Central California for a couple of years.
Okay. Did you ever change majors in college, or did you start off right with agricultural science?
So I started in junior college, and so in California and in the Western U.S. utilizes junior college much better than we do on this side of the country.
Yeah, I've never heard of that.
So I could go to a junior college and not get a degree. But if I put in 60 credit hours at a junior college and I have a reasonable GPA, I think like above a 2.5, you're automatically eligible to transfer into a Cal State or a UC system.
Okay.
So we have 2 university systems in California. And so at the time, I wanted to get as far away from my parents as possible. So I thought 12 hours of straight driving would do it. They moved up to Northern California before I did. So that shortened that distance.
Yeah.
But I wanted to go to Chico because it was one of the smaller ag colleges. There's 5 ag colleges in California. And it was one of the smaller schools that we're going to have. One of my academic advisor, I used to buy sheep from him when I was showing sheep in California. And I still talk to him to this day. So Dr. Patton was very influential on my life. And then I was also on the livestock judging team. Okay. So that part of it, which it's, you give up at Chico, you give up 2 years of your life to judge. But we were from a small school, but we were nationally competitive.
Okay.
So anywhere, I mean, like West Virginia University, we have about 1,500, 1,600 kids in the College of Agriculture. When I was at Chico in the mid-90s, we had 300.
Oh, wow.
So we were competing against schools that had 10 times the number of students that we did.
Wow.
And beating them. So that was the fun part of that. And it gave you a lot of exposure to the agriculture industry, to the animal industry in the United States. So that was fun. But that was just a part of my career. I did that, and then I was a high school ag teacher, and then I decided that wasn't for me. So I moved from California to Maine, and I ran a nonprofit rare breeds farm for the guy who invented the Ethernet. Okay. So they had this visitor farm in Midcoast, Maine. So I lived there. I lived in Maine for 5 years. I worked at Kelmscott Farm for 2 years. And then I met some guys that were doing a research project on Katahdin sheep. So they're hair sheep, and they look a little different than other sheep that I'm more accustomed to. And I was at a extension meeting, and I was giving them some static from the back of the room. And we spent the next hour and a half talking after the meeting. And these 2 guys, one guy was at Bowdon College in Maine, and then another guy was from Ohio State. And those 2 guys worked together on this project. And so I quit my job at Kelmscott and then moved to the University of Maine and started a graduate program there, and looking at the genetics of parasite resistance in sheep. Okay. So the more I studied the genetics of it, the more I had to learn immunology.
Yeah.
And that's where the immunology thing comes in. So I went in there into my graduate program thinking that I was going to be a geneticist. And my master's was in animal genetics. And then so I finished that, and I didn't have a PhD program lined up. So I took a year off, and I worked for a moth geneticist at North Carolina State. Okay. And so I moved down there, and I was managing her breeding colony.
You've been all over the place.
This is the 7th state I've lived in. So I was down in Raleigh for a year, and I met my wife down there. So we continued to date after I left there, and then I went to Virginia Tech. Mm-hmm. I wanted to work with the best sheep geneticist in the world, and that was Dr. Notter at Virginia Tech. And I was taking his population genetics class, and he was talking to me in the hallway one day, and he put his arm around me. He's like, "We need to find you." He's like, "You are a brilliant molecular biologist, but you're terrible at I'm not god awful at it. It wasn't as natural to me. I take a molecular biology class, I can get an A, my eyes closed, no problem. Population genetics and quantitative genetics, I had to sit there and study, and I had to work for it. And the other, my lab mates did not. The math just came to them easier. But we're in biochemistry, all of that came easier to me. We're in cell biology, that was easy for me and hard for them. So you kind of, sometimes you find those tracks while you're doing that. And while my PI was not an immunologist, I was also older. So I was 30 when I started my PhD program. And he said, a lot of this is going to be on you because he said, I don't know if this is going to work. So we're just hoping. And he's like, I'm hoping that you've done enough of this work. But he's such a brilliant scientist anyway that he can design projects and taught me how to do all of the kind of experimental design and train me as a scientist to do that. And that's how that all worked. So I got done with my PhD and I was looking for postdoc. So I had a postdoc offer at Virginia Tech to stay at the vet school, there, working with stress and wean beef calves. Or I saw an ad in the back of Science when I was studying for my prelims, and there was a guy at a parasite immunology lab that was looking for a postdoc. And I talked to my boss about it, and I said, what do you think? He's like, oh, just apply for it and see what happens. I did. About 10 minutes after I sent the email, I got a phone call from the guy, and it was just weird. It just happened so quick. So I was always worried about, if I go into mouse world, am I ever going to be able to come back to agriculture?
Yeah.
And then my advisor said, you owe us. You have to come back. So we want you to go get trained and do all that stuff. So when I graduated in 2009, I moved to New Jersey. I still wasn't done with I hadn't defended my dissertation. And my wife was defending her master's at the same time down in North Carolina. So we got married that fall. I was in New Jersey. She was in North Carolina. And then I was starting working in this lab that had the cover of Nature on the door to their lab because they'd been on the cover multiple times.
Wow.
They had 3 R01 grants in the lab. The guy I worked for was the dean for research at the medical school in New Jersey.
Wow.
There was 5 postdocs in the lab. There's 2 grad students. It was huge. And every toy, every tool, every mouse model that you could think of, we had at your disposal.
That's insane.
Right. You want laser capture microdissection, no problem. It's right there in the lab. We didn't use the core facility because we had all of that equipment. The only thing we used a core for was for flow cytometry.
Yeah.
But we had all of our own fluorescent microscopes. Everything was right there. It was amazing. So, and then we had all of these mouse models, and it was just what are the immune responses generated by, or that are a part of full host protective immunity to enteric parasites, so the ones that are ingested and go right to their small intestine, or parasites that do hepatotracheal migration. So they go through the blood, get coughed up in the lungs, and then swallowed, and then go back to their site. So we did that, those 2 kind of different models, and we're able to dissect, are macrophages more important in this one versus this one? What happens if we conditionally deplete macrophages during this one? Well, we found out the mice started dying because they couldn't clean up the lung injury from the parasite infestation. Wow. So when the parasites get into the lung, they cause damage when they come out of blood into the lung because they're moving around in the lung tissue, and it causes all these red blood cells. So we have this great image of a macrophage that ingested a neutrophil that had red blood cells inside of it.
Wow. So
they're all stacked right on top of each other.
Insane.
It's just a random picture. And one of the postdocs there said, Scott, you got to see this. And I said, it is like the turducken of macrophage, neutrophil, red blood cell. But we were looking at all of that stuff. So I was able to publish, my PI came to me, he's like, hey, we're going to write a news and views article in Nature Immunology about this new paper that came out that redefines how macrophages differentiate. And he said, you have to do all the artwork and you have to write the entire thing. Oh, so like those things are in the front of Nature that discuss the papers that are later in there.
Yeah.
I got to write one of those.
That's
so
insane.
It was crazy. Like you go from being in ag world and trying to do as much immunology as you can to be on the leading edge of kind of Th2 immune responses in the world. So that was really fun. Yeah. And then I was there for 16 months, and then this job opened up. so I talked to the guy I was working for at the time, and I said, listen, there's this job opening up in West Virginia. It is a place that my wife and I talked about that we could both be successful at. And he said, if you just give me like 2 more years, you can write your ticket wherever you want to go. You want to go to Harvard, you want to go to UPenn, you want to be at Temple, wherever you want to go, world's your oyster. Just give me 2 more years. He said, the jobs will always be there. I said, yeah, but none of those places have ag. And at the end of the day, that's what I do. So he was okay with that. And he let me apply for the job and do all this stuff. I had no expectation I would get it. And I did. And then my wife did her PhD here. She's a reproductive physiologist. So we had, at the time, there was an interdisciplinary reproductive physiology program between health sciences, biology, and animal science.
Oh, wow.
So the people in animal science that managed that interdisciplinary program had trained all of the top repro-phys people across the world. So a lot of these people that do reproductive physiology, whether it's in livestock or humans or mice, any of that stuff, you can trace their lineage back to WVU, their academic lineage. So, which is really neat. So she got to do her PhD here. She's now a assistant professor over in health sciences in phys and pharmacology, and does reproductive physiology, looking at different models of inhaled toxicant exposure.
Oh, wow.
So like vaping models or titanium dioxide inhalation. So she uses the iTox facility over there and then does all the reproductive side of inhaled toxicants.
That's crazy.
Yes.
Very interesting topic. You've been all over the place. Like you said, you live in 7 states?
I count California twice because it's a big state.
Yeah, it is.
Right. So I grew up in Southern California, then moved to Northern California, but really it's 6. So my wife and I have 2 daughters here that are born here, and Charlotte and Genevieve, and it's a challenge. So when she started here, I was a faculty member and she was a grad student, but she was in biology but her office was over here. So there was that challenge of everything. And then when she got done, it was, okay, now what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And wherever, I was in a position where I'd already gotten tenure. So I said, if you need to go somewhere, then we can go together. And it shouldn't be that big of a deal, but it just never materialized. And she got a postdoc working over at Health Sciences with Dr. Nurkowitz in physiology, and then I can see his face, Dr. Goodman. And so Dr. Goodman does more neuro reproductive physiology, and Dr. Nurkowitz doesn't do any repro-phys. He's a toxicologist and cardiovascular biologist, right?
Wow.
So she was able to link those 2 guys together for her postdoc, and then that turned into a research assistant professor position, which finally turned in. She got a K award, and now is working on more stuff on her own. So she's in a tenure track position now.
That's crazy. So kind of switching gears back to you.
Sure.
Walk me through what a typical day is like for you as a associate professor.
Okay, so in agriculture, typically we have split appointments.
Okay.
So I am 50% research, 30% teaching, 40% teaching, and 10% service.
Okay.
So I teach anywhere between 3 and 4 classes a semester.
Okay.
Right? So I've got that. I've got a large enrollment class that has laboratories, that has 4 3-hour laboratories.
Whoa.
So on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, I teach for 6 hours straight, from 11 o'clock to 5 o'clock.
Wow.
Right, on both those days. Wednesday morning, so Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I have an 8 o'clock class all 3 of those days. So a typical day for me looks like balancing teaching and research and the service component.
Wow.
So my research blends itself really well into helping producers across the country. Okay. So I will be giving webinars online one day and doing a webinar for North Dakota State. Wow. And then another one for Texas and another one for Virginia. We have projects that are going on I have collaborators in Virginia. So I have 3 graduate students. One of them, his project's down there.
Mm-hmm.
Another student, her project is down there, but all of her samples have already been collected. So she's just managing and doing all the lab work. I have another student that's looking at neutrophil function and neutrophil biology and breed differences in that. So I have 3 graduate students. I have 3 undergraduates that are working with those graduate students. I have a researcher, a technician that I have to manage.
Wow.
And then always thinking about what's next, right? What's the next project? So we wrote a grant for one of my students, and I wrote a grant together to submit to the National Center for Veterinary Parasitology. I've got another budget that's due today for another grant that I'm working on with people at Purdue, at USDA ARS in Nebraska, North Carolina State, and University of Nevada. So we're all working on a project together. So it's always trying to get those other dollars in to support your research activity. And then, we submitted a manuscript last week. It is as varied as a kaleidoscope of the activity. Every day is different than the next.
Yeah.
So there's nothing, I can't say that I have a typical day. Yeah. Every day is completely different. And then throw in their teaching. Or like yesterday morning, I was doing carcass ultrasounds on sheep at the farm. Yeah. And then I came in and I was working in the office. And then I had a impromptu meeting with a graduate student about how you're going to manage a faculty position when you graduate from here. That lasted an hour and a half that I didn't plan on, but it happens. And that's part of the day. It's not, the great thing about this job is the variety and the unpredictability of everything, but the day doesn't really end. So I was doing stuff when I got home. I'm still a dad. I'm a husband. You have all of these other things that are going on. So
balancing everything
it's
else.
a big challenge to balance all of that, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So what's your research about?
So umbrella topic is how does parasite resistance work in sheep? Okay. So if you've got a dog or a cat and you think about how you control heartworm disease in those dogs or cats, right? You give them frontline, you give them the HeartGuard pellets. Yep. All right. Imagine if that didn't work. Your dog dies, right? Yeah. Or you bought the drug, gave it to him, and it still died. That is what it's like every day for sheep producers across the world. All the drugs that we have don't work anymore. Huh. Which makes it incredibly difficult to manage sheep on grass because sheep are ruminants. They can utilize grass that other species can't. We can't utilize grass to do anything nutritionally. Yeah. So we utilize sheep for that. If the sheep can't develop any immune response to it, or we can't treat them with drugs to get rid of the parasite infection, we have to think about alternative methods of managing that. So there's something in livestock production that we look at. We look at kind of genetics of selection. Okay. And we can estimate an animal's genetic merit for a trait. Okay. By measuring it and then measuring it in their relatives and then accumulating all that data together so we know what proportion of the phenotypic variation there's in that trait is due to genetics or the heritability for that trait. Okay. So knowing all of that, we have breeding values for parasite resistance. So we have some animals that are more resistant than another animal is. Okay. We have some breeds that exhibit excellent protection against parasites with no drug needed at all, versus some breeds that will not survive without drug treatment, even though the drugs don't work very well. Okay. They need something, right? Yeah. So the first thing that we're looking at is we've got one breed of sheep that is absolutely resistant to parasites. You give it to them, they get it, they get over it. The next time they see it, they never get it. Okay. That's like perfect protection of what's your textbook protection. When you come into this other breed, you give it to them, they get it, they get higher levels of it, even though you're giving the same amount of pathogen load. They get higher levels of it and they can't clear it. And it takes them almost up to a year or 2 years of age before they develop full protective immunity. So we're looking at what is the biology of the immune system that's so much different in this one breed of sheep. It's in the same species, right?
Yeah.
So why is this one breed different than the other breed? What do they do different? What is the characterization of their immune response? How does it vary within different stages? Because that parasite takes different forms throughout their body.
Yeah.
So that's what we look at, the immune response to the larval stage, the adult stage, the egg stage. What cytokines are there? What antibody is there? What cells are being recruited to that site? How does that affect local lymph nodes? All of those things. That's what we get to dissect that, right? But we don't have all the tools and all of the things that are available to mouse researchers. You know, you've got knockouts of this and that. So we have to be more clever with our experiments to get around the fact that I don't have a sheep that's an IL-4 knockout.
Yeah.
Or I don't have IL-4 that has a knock-in with GFP on it, or a GFP reporter. So I don't have those tools. I've got to think about different ways to do that. How can we do the same things that you do in mice, but I can't use any of the tools that you have?
Yeah.
You have to be the experiments that we have to design have to be very elegant and also have to have a lot of animals.
Yeah.
And you have to think about relationships with all that thing. And also remember that you have a gestation of 5 months, and you won't be able to use them until they're 60 days old after they've been taken off their mom.
Yeah.
So you have, I'm planning experiments 18 months in advance of actually conducting them. So that's the big picture stuff. And then we work with one breed called the Katahdin that was made in the United States in the 50s in Maine. And that's where I started working with Katahdin sheep about 20 years ago. And we work with them. We're looking at how sheep that are selected to be more parasite resistant in the Katahdin breed, how they are differing. So what is the other outcomes of selection for parasite resistance? So most recently, we're finding that it's survivability.
Okay.
So now, no matter what the pathogen challenge is, if it's viral, bacterial, protozoa, whatever, they respond better regardless. So when you select animals to be resistant to parasites, you're selecting them to be disease resistant.
Yeah.
Which is extraordinarily powerful now, because we used to be able to use antibiotics and be able to go to feed store and buy antibiotics to treat animals. Now, as of June of this year, that requires a veterinarian's prescription.
Okay.
So it's going to make producers, whether you're raising beef cattle or sheep or hogs or horses, bees, any animal, to get any antibiotics, to get those, you have to have a prescription.
Okay.
So if you can control the need for having that prescription, you're doing a better job. So we're trying to think of genetics as a new antibiotic.
Okay.
Right?
That's very interesting.
We're doing that. My student has looked at vaccine response in lambs, which is really easy. We're always vaccinating them. You don't have to have a prescription for the vaccine.
Yeah.
So, and then we can look at antibody response in animals that are divergently mated for resistance to parasites. So if you're very resistant, we take males that are resistant and cross them with females that are resistant. We take males that are susceptible and cross them with females that are susceptible to generate a divergent breeding structure.
Okay.
And we've been doing that down at Virginia Tech for about 7 years now.
Wow.
And that farm manages all those sheep down in Glade Spring, Virginia, almost to Tennessee, far southwest Virginia. And then we use that experiment station as a place where we do most of our research. Okay. So it's a collaborative research project with us, Virginia Tech, and NC State. So all three institutions use that farm, use the animals that come from that divergent mating strategy for a variety of different experiments. So we've looked at the quality of colostrum in the low-bred animals versus the susceptible animals. And they've got 2.5 times the amount of IgG in their colostrum than the ones that are more parasite susceptible.
Wow.
So they just set their lambs up better.
Yeah.
So then we're starting to think about, okay, if they've got all of this antibody, can I take the colostrum from this sheep and give it to this one over here? And it becomes complicated, right?
Yeah.
Because what I really want to do is I want to take lambs that are born to moms that are susceptible and raise them on moms that are resistant, and take their lambs and put them on the other ewes and cross-foster lambs that way. That is extraordinarily complicated.
Yeah.
And it's really, really hard to get used to take another lamb.
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to think about ways to do that. Then we're also looking at how that divergent mating scheme may affect animal behavior while they're grazing. So we've got, one of my students has GPS collars on the ewes, and we're tracking how far do they move every day? Where do they go? How many steps do they take? Which direct, just a million different data points that are coming in off of these animals that are wearing GPS collars. And then we're not doing it. We just dump them all out together and they're grazing the same fields. Are the parasite resistant sheep more active?
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you're healthier, typically you are more active. Isn't that what we tell everybody? If you're active and moving and exercising and doing this stuff, you're healthier.
Yeah.
Do we see the same things? And producers can't look at sheep and tell that. But then can I take those data from a farm where we know the genotypes of those animals and apply them to the farm where we don't know the genotypes? Because we have antibody differences in the animal, just regular circulating antibody, we've got differences between them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're doing now, and then thinking about whether or not this crosses breed. Okay. So does it just in the Katahdins or is it in polypays, which are very popular in the Midwest? So we're doing work like that, and then we're also looking at neutrophil function. So still kind of a carryover from some of my other students' projects and looking at their migration and response to chemotractants. So we find that in the parasite-resistant sheep, they have more neutrophils that respond early to the parasite infection, and we've got more interleukin-4 that comes, and we found that neutrophils produce interleukin-4 in both breeds equally. But if you're not there, it doesn't matter if you can produce it.
Yeah.
There's just no call for neutrophils, or the parasite is producing something that blocks that.
Oh, wow.
So we're taking those chemicals that the parasites produce and using that to see if it is blocking the migration of neutrophils to a known chemotractant. So we just use IL-8 as the known chemotractant and then incubate the neutrophils with excreted products from the parasite.
Wow.
It's kind of fun.
Yeah, that sounds really
So I
fun.
do this, I've got a foot in both worlds. I'm an applied scientist and I'm also a basic scientist.
Yeah.
So we study parasite immunology. We also study kind of sheep production, how managing sheep for parasite resistance affects other traits.
That's very interesting.
It's cool.
So you've told me a lot about how you've gotten to where you are today and like how you've traveled all over the United States and stuff. Looking back at your past and all that travel and accomplishments that you had, what do you think has been your biggest failure throughout? And you can take a few minutes to think about it.
I don't know. My biggest failure was my first research project as a faculty member. So
Here?
Yep.
Okay.
I had gotten a grant from a feed company out in Minnesota, or Iowa is where they were from. And they make this yeast fermentation product. And what we were going to do is see if that works as an immunomodulator. So if it activates macrophages in sheep, because macrophages are really important in parasite infections. So we want to see if we could activate macrophages in sheep that are susceptible to parasites as a way to kind of feed around the parasite issue.
Yeah.
So I needed about 80 lambs to do this project. And they all had to be parasite naive. And I just can't find sheep that have never been exposed to a parasite in their life.
Yeah.
You usually have to raise them that way. So I bought 40 bred ewes from a producer in Southwest Pennsylvania. And I brought them here, and I was so excited. I had this $100,000 grant from a company, which is crazy, and I was just so proud of myself. And I was talking to my former advisor, and I said, yeah, we got these ewes. And he's like, what breed are they? I said, well, they're mostly Dorset, but they have a little bit of Texel in them. He said, well, you better be careful. There's a little bit of parasite resistance in those Texels. And I said, oh, no, it's been diluted out in these Dorsets. None of the parasite stuff worked on those at all.
Oh.
But it became, so this is turning a failure into a success.
Yeah.
We started breeding Texel sheep and understanding that Texels had a little bit of immunity to this, even crossbred Texels. So these sheep were maybe at most 1/4 Texel, and they were very parasite resistant.
Wow.
So then we started looking at the mechanism. So I had a student come in from Tech. He was from Michigan, went to Michigan State, then did his master's at Virginia Tech, working on a project with me that I was doing down there. And then he did his PhD with me up here. And he's a farm kid. And I said, listen, your job right now, no more farm stuff. We're just in the lab. We want to figure out the mechanism of immunity that's going on in the Texels versus the St. Croix. He did it.
Wow.
And it was amazing. So there's been a series of failures all along the way. And that's the one that sticks out the most to me because it was so dynamic. It was a multiple level failure. But all of those things, I think anytime that anybody who's successful has failed more times than they've succeeded, but they've been able to turn failure into something positive, whether you learn something from it or it causes you to get some perspective and take a step back and say, okay, because what happened after that Texel thing, there's a guy in Terra Alta that was a Texel breeder here in West Virginia, and he suddenly passed away. So his family called me and said, we have all these Texel sheep. Would you buy them from us? And I said, well, you know what? I do have the money. Let's do it. So I bought those Texel ewes. We started this big Texel project at West Virginia. And we had one of the best flocks in the United States of Texel sheep.
Wow.
So I was working with another producer in Minnesota. He was importing semen from the UK. Then he and I were importing semen together. So some was going to his place, some was going to mine. We were submitting data to the National Sheep Improvement Program that generate breeding values for all of these traits. We actually got enough data together so we had a fecal A count breeding value for Texel sheep when Katahdins were the only ones that had it before. And finally last year, I decided that we had done enough with these, and there's been some structural changes at the farm system that also promoted it. So we sold off our entire flock of Texel sheep.
Wow.
So with livestock sales now, there's a lot of them that go online, and that was all because of COVID. COVID really made online sales a big thing. Before, people would have online sales and they really wouldn't sell very well. Now everybody's used to them because of COVID. That sale started at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then they do something that's called racehorse style bidding. So the sale stops at 5 o'clock that night. But every time somebody bids up to that end, it extends the length of the sale for another 5 minutes. That sale went on until 2:30 in the morning. It was the longest sale they've ever had in this auctions platform that's based out of Iowa. And the guy that was running, so we grossed about $60,000 on selling 90 sheep.
Wow.
And they went all over the country. So we had so much of a reputation on building those Texels up. And it was such a big thing. So we were doing the applied stuff and we're still doing the basic science with them. So long story short, it took a failure and turned it into a success story. And that's how anybody is successful.
Yeah, definitely. So going off of that now, the opposite of what I just asked, what has been your biggest success throughout your career?
So I got into this job not to be kind of this world-renowned scientist. I got in this job to train students, right?
Okay.
So my biggest success is my students. My first graduate student now she runs her own lab for the Massachusetts State Department of Health.
Wow.
She was a CDC Leadership Fellow.
Wow.
She did a postdoc at Emory University in T-cell biology. She runs now the CDC's Leadership Fellow program and manages all of those students. So you got her. There's another gal that graduated about the same time. She just finished her PhD in kind of managing resident students at Marshall University. That first cohort of like 4 students I had, 2 of them became veterinarians. Jessica ended up doing her PhD with me and then going to Emory and then becoming a captain in the Uniform Health Service.
Wow.
Another student is an immunology professor in the animal science department at the University of Tennessee. Another one is doing his postdoc in nano vaccine delivery down at UNC Chapel Hill.
Mm-hmm.
Another gal is down doing flu vaccine research at the CDC in Atlanta. So I have a student who is the state small ruminant extension specialist at North Carolina. Another kid is a Penn State extension specialist. So that's my success.
These are students.
Yes.
That's very inspiring. So talking about students more, when you pick grad students, do you pick them off of a characteristic? What is the most admirable characteristic that you see in students? It's kind of two questions.
I don't care about their GPA. I mean, they got to have a GPA to get in the door.
Yeah. I'm
looking at work ethic. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at, are you willing to give up yourself for these next? So every different parts of academia do graduate training a little bit different. So the way we do it in kind of the agriculture model is to do a master's degree, then a PhD. Health sciences brings you in as a PhD student and you're there for 5 years.
Yeah.
Right? And if you flunk out, you get a master's.
Yeah.
Right? So the way we do this here is you have to complete a master's degree.
Okay.
Then you can move on for a PhD.
Okay.
Right? We can bring you in as a PhD student for 5 years, but you miss that component of defending a thesis and writing and doing it twice before you're done. I think actually helps you a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I've had a lot of faculty from health sciences on my students' committees, and the general comment is, I would not pass your exam. The stuff that your kids have to go through, thinking about both basic and applied science and being able to apply what you're doing and think about these things and how they all fit together. So the way I recruit students is not through taking random people that apply to the program generally. I take people who apply to me directly.
Okay.
They're emailing me, and it's very different than health sciences. So at HSC, you've got to rotate around these different labs, and then it's kind of like musical chairs. You hope you end on somebody that you like, and then you stay with them and do it that way.
Yeah.
What I do is I make them come out here for an interview.
Okay.
So I've interviewed kids from California and Montana and Wyoming and Florida and New York City and all over the place. My students have come from everywhere. Mm-hmm. And they all come out here and they interview. And so I'll meet with them. I'll show them around the buildings. But the biggest part of the interview is they sit down and I buy lunch for all of my graduate students, so they get to talk to that person. And they're instructed by me to be brutally honest. So that anybody who's moving here from, Nebraska or somewhere out west, there's no misinterpretation of what it's like to be here.
Okay.
So I don't get as many kids that quit, or it's happened. I've had a gal from Texas that came here and she couldn't handle the weather. And that was probably one of the biggest things. And it was just the speed at which the lab operated.
Yeah.
And she said, you know what? I knew this.
Yeah.
And she said, this isn't you. This is me. I can't handle this.
Yeah.
So you try to mitigate some of that stuff, but honest to God, every kid that you bring in is a roll of the dice. Yeah. You try to mitigate as much risk as possible. So I look at GPA. I talk to people. I don't just read the letters of recommendation. I call their recommenders and say, all right, give me the straight word on this kid.
Yeah.
Are they going to be able, more often than not, I know them, or I know of them, or I've got some connection to them, and I can be their recommenders can be very honest and blunt and say whether or not they'll work. And I trust that probably more than a letter.
Yeah.
I've taken kids with suboptimal GPAs. I was a suboptimal student. Mm-hmm. I had a 2.75. That's all I needed to get in the teaching program at Chico.
Yeah.
And I was working most of the time, and I get it. But the work ethic, are you ready to give up? Your graduate program is just a very short period of time in your life.
Yeah.
And it's 5 years for the rest of your life. And if you're not willing to give up during that time, how's anybody know that you're going to be willing to give up any part of yourself to actually perform the duties needed in your career?
Yeah.
But that all comes with the statement of balance. So when my students come in, we make a deal in the beginning, right? Is that I'm going to continuously push you until you cannot do anything else.
Yeah.
So I'm going to push, make you feel comfortable, push, make you feel comfortable, push, and just keep doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So they get better at it. But I would never ask them to do something I would never do myself.
Okay.
And I think so you build a little bit of trust and respect. And, I wouldn't say to these kids, yeah, go out there and work these cattle. I don't know what to do. You guys just figure it out. That's not me.
Yeah.
So kids that get put in that position typically fail or don't do very well with it. They've got to be really mature and really good and already know a little bit. So I don't know. There's no magic to it. I wish there was like a magic formula to picking grad students. I've been lucky and very fortunate with the students I've had come through. They're all very bright. These kids will lay down in traffic for me because they know that I would do the same for them. So even once they leave here, like next weekend, I'm going to one of my former students' wedding. And the weekend after that, I've got another former student's wedding. So they're still kind of a part of your extended family.
Yeah.
So if you don't have that, I don't know if that's good, bad, or indifferent, but with every student, it's a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not one right way to train graduate students. There's not one right way to select graduate students. It's almost a gut feeling, and that's where that interview comes in.
Yeah.
The girl that quit was the only person I didn't interview in person.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I knew, right? So I had a gal that came out from Colorado. That's a couple years ago now. And I was very honest. She said, I appreciate you being so honest because that it helps me make a decision. And I think that graduate school is as much the students picking the professors as it is the professors picking the students.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like dating. I know that's an odd analogy, but you got to see there's got to be a fit, right?
Yeah.
There's got to be a personality fit. So it's a lot of my gut. And my first graduate student was a huge gamble. Huge. She's a rock star.
Yeah.
So I don't regret that for a minute.
Mm-hmm. So work ethic is basically what in all your students, like even your undergraduates, that's what you admire
the
most?
Undergraduates, I do not. So undergraduates, the ones that stay around are the ones that prove themselves useful.
Okay.
If you can't make time for the research and you can't balance that stuff, you're replaceable.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's a snotty approach to undergraduate training, but most of them are looking for an easy way just to get some research to put on their vet application and go to vet school or med school or wherever, or some sort of professional school. So I take advantage of the fact that they need that. I need some down and dirty labor. If you're not willing to do the down and dirty labor and work yourself up, we're done.
Yeah.
It's really straightforward and simple. My training of undergraduates happens once they make it past the cut phase.
Yeah.
The cut phase is the first couple months.
Mm-hmm.
Are you there? Do you show up? Do you ask questions and do those kind of things? I am more likely to take undergraduates that have been recommended by another professor. Okay. And not just show up and like, I need undergraduate research, right?
Yeah.
And I get a lot of that. And I understand because there's no written way of code of approaching this stuff, right? So I gamble on every single undergraduate, knowing that 9 times out of 10 I'm going to lose, but that 1 out of 10 could be awesome.
Yeah. So
that's the mix with those kids. It's completely different than graduate students.
Yeah. Well, undergraduate, like you said, it's a snotty approach, but undergraduate is where kids start building themselves.
Correct. And if they're not willing to work,
they're setting themselves up.
Right. And I am very honest with all of them. They do not get FaceTime with me. It's all with the grad students.
Okay.
And if you make it past that and you prove yourself to be useful, then that's a whole different story. So I've had undergrads that transition into graduate students that work for me. And those kids, once they've bought into me, I've got them for life.
Yeah.
You know, one of the kids that did this, he was an undergraduate student. He did an undergraduate research project with me. I was judging a livestock show in Pennsylvania and met him there and saw him as a student here. And then he was on the livestock judging team here with me. And he needed a place to go because he got waitlisted at Purdue for vet school and wasn't going to get in. So he's a smart kid. I know that he's a hard worker because his dad runs an electrical business and doesn't hire any employees except for his sons. And they work constantly. Plus, they run a whole cattle operation in Greene County. And
wow.
So that kid worked for me, did all of this stuff, and I knew that he always wanted to go to vet school. Mm-hmm. So a small project would get him through. He got waitlisted at Michigan, but then got in. And since then is doing phenomenally well.
Wow.
So my job is to get kids where they need to be.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not the same program for every student. And my approach with every student is not the same because some of them need the whip, some of them don't.
Yeah.
Right? You gotta, I don't know how you train people to do that, but you just have to kind of watch them. You have to have perspective on all of them as they're doing stuff. And it's not, I didn't have that perspective on my first grad student. That poor kid got the worst of me a lot of the times, but she would always complain. She's like, you are so much easier on all these kids now. I said, yeah, but they're not, I'm still getting the same result.
Yeah.
Right? They're doing really well. And there is a reputation, there's a tradition for the kids that come out of the lab now. And that's what they all want to uphold. They want to be those kids that I tell stories about when I'm at meetings or on different things like this.
Yeah. So. That's really interesting. So now that we've kind of gone through your whole educational and teaching life up to this point, if you could go back to your college self, what type of advice or what piece of advice would you give him?
So I screwed myself up by not being a better student. And it didn't happen until when I was in graduate school. I started treating school like a job.
Okay.
I think sometimes we just treat school like another hoop we have to jump through.
Yeah.
And not really about, hey, this is going to set you up for the rest of your life. And I didn't realize that until I was trying to get into graduate schools with the 275, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was really, somebody had to know you well enough to know that the risk was going to be, there was going to be a low risk that you were going to fail. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I would tell myself to treat school like a job. If you're going to go to school, be there for 8 hours. When I was, and I think people tried to tell me this when I was in school, because I really enjoyed working at the farm. I worked at the university farm, mm-hmm. and I was the manager of the swine unit because I wanted to have nothing to do with sheep. And I was shearing sheep on the side, and that paid my way through college for all my degrees, was shearing sheep. So I was always out shearing. But I was working all the time.
Yeah.
And I was working probably 80 hours a week at the swine unit, but I was only getting paid for 20.
Oh, wow.
And it was my judging team coach that came to me, and he's probably the worst person about it because the guy doesn't sleep. Because he was a professor and also ran 500 cows at home and lived an hour away from the university. So he was one to talk about. About time, but he was really good. I mean, he's a very brilliant man. And he came to me, he's like, Scott, you're working 20 hours a week, you're failing nutrition. When is it going to snap into your head that this doesn't matter, but this does?
Yeah.
And it really didn't dawn on me until much later in life. And I needed that time to mature a little bit and and get older and wiser and all those kind of things. And it's what I tell students now. If I had my own spot in the library at the University of Maine. Mm-hmm. There was an old steel spiral staircase in the back dungeons of the library that went down to this room that nobody ever went to. And I had a desk there, and then nobody would bother me.
Wow.
And I could eat there because you can't eat in libraries, right? I could sneak my food in there and just be there all day.
Wow.
And that's how, I failed my first, it was the molecular biology of the cell. No, it's a molecular genetics class. And this class was also piped into Jackson's lab as their kind of continuing ed course for people that were doing all the mouse breeding there.
Yeah.
And the exams were take-home exams. There was like 7 questions on there, and I answered the questions. I thought I answered them well. I failed the first exam. And then I went to the professor and I was like, listen, what do I need to do? He's like, you need to write an answer that's more than just the answer. How did you get to the answer? What information gets you to that point? It's a take-home exam. So I started sitting there and I would write for days on these exams. I went from having a 50 on the first exam to a 98 on the second exam. I got a 98 on the third exam and a 95 on the last exam.
Wow.
And he said, that has never happened to me. Kids who get Fs on the first exam are usually done.
Yeah.
But I got it once I understood that. So that would be my biggest piece of advice to myself, right? Probably spend a little bit more time studying and a little less time at the bar. And probably a little less time milking cows and working as much. But I had to. My dad had lost his job. They had to move from Southern California to Northern California. They were just in a financial wreck. And my little sister was still in high school, so I didn't want to be a burden on them. So I was shearing sheep. I was roofing houses. I was a security guard. God, what else did I do in college? I used to trot horses out for horse sales in Los Angeles.
Wow.
Any job that paid me money. Hauling trees or palm trees. I used to plant palm trees in people's yards.
Wow.
And I would just haul them around. And that was anything to make money on the side doing that stuff. So and then I was also working at the junior college I went to had a farm, and I was working at that farm. And then the university I went to, I was working at that farm.
Yeah.
So I got into this sense of that my work defined me and not what my future career was going to be. Okay. So that's what I tell myself. Treat school like a job, get that job done first, then you can do other things.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I've never thought about it like that, like treating school. Like I always say, I have to go to class from this time to this time today.
Right.
But I've never thought of it like a job because...
Did you put in your 8 to 10 hours today?
Yeah.
Right?
It's an interesting perspective.
If you do that, this is the thing. So my wife taught me this. My wife had a full academic scholarship to attend NC State. So she got everything paid for, had a stipend, the whole thing. And she was out, and she was an undergrad when I was there as a lab manager. And we have 9 years in between us. And she was young and wild and crazy and doing all this stuff. I said, how can you do this and still graduate in the top 1% of the school? I mean, how's she's like, oh, because I did everything in this time frame.
Yeah.
And it just like, oh, this is like your job.
Yeah.
And and a lot of students, it doesn't dawn on them that this is a job.
Yeah.
That's all it is. And your job right now is to read. Your job is to learn. Your job is to challenge yourself in these courses.
Yeah.
And not just wait for the professor to do it. You're going to have to seek it out. You're going to have to test yourself before the professor tests you on this stuff.
Yeah.
So if you do that during the 8-hour day, right,
mm-hmm.
then your evenings and your weekends all of a sudden become free. You don't have to cram because you've been doing it the whole time.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a really interesting way to think about it.
That's the way so when I was advising undergraduates, that's what I would tell them. Find the spot in the library. That is your spot. Don't study with other people because, let's be real, you're not really studying, right? Everybody's talking about something else. Take your phone, put it on silent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing's that important, but also make breaks for yourself. It's just like when you're working out, every now and then you just need a break just to catch your breath and relax and let your mind calm down.
Yeah.
Schedule those things in, and it can help with all of that.
Yeah, definitely.
And start teaching yourself balance now. Work out, go to a gym, go for a walk, do those kind of things. Get away from the people that are here and the environment that's here. Don't go home. Go somewhere else. Find somewhere new. Go to Cooper's Rock. Go to Dorsey's Knob. Go to different places around. You know, they're all around here. I didn't do a lot of that in college. I was either apartment, school, farm, bar. And that was my 4 places that you would find me, right? That's it. And I wasn't going out and doing as many things outside of that. So I wish I'd done more of that, but I wish I'd been a better student. That would have made my life so much easier. It would have given me more options to go to graduate school.
Definitely.
So
to kind of wrap things up a little bit, is there a question or topic that you wish we would have talked about, or a question that I would have asked you throughout this interview?
No.
Kind of
You've hit
covered
on
all the
everything.
bases.
I mean, is there anything more you want from me? I mean,
no. This was a very interesting conversation that we had.
Okay.
So the last question I have for you is kind of completely off topic.
Right.
The name of my podcast is called Samples of Science Cuisine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like a little quip. What's your favorite type of cuisine or food?
Oh, I joke about my wife that I'm part Italian, and I'm not at all. But that Italian food is my jam. That's
I like Italian food too.
Yes. When I lived in New Jersey, I mean, we lived on the bluffs overlooking New York City.
Mm-hmm.
We were right like where that airplane landed in the Hudson. We were right there.
Wow.
We just moved there a few months after that had happened.
Wow.
So, I mean, you come out of our apartment complex, and then there was the New York City skyline right there in front of you.
That's beautiful.
There was a Italian restaurant that was down below us that was on this weird corner. And it was kind of a hole-in-the-wall restaurant that tried to dress itself up, but it had absolutely the best Italian food I've ever had in my life.
Yeah.
And we went to a lot of places in New York City that had, you know, you can go to Little Italy and do that stuff, but it's the little hole-in-the-wall places that are always the best. So that's
Definitely.
Yep.
It's really, well, thank you for having this conversation today. It was very interesting.
You bet. Anytime.
Thank you. That's